Hey guys, what's up? Bret here and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be looking at the pros and cons of buying a house in 2020. We're going to be looking at the things to consider if you're thinking about buying a house. So let's go. Before we start, let's just check out two graphs, one from the UK, one from the US. They're from Statista.com and they're statistics on home ownership. In 2016 in the US and 2017 in the UK, you'll actually see that home ownership was at its lowest rate since the late 1960s. And the reason for this is believed to be millennials not wanting to get into the housing market. Since then though, we have seen an increase from around 63% in the US and UK up to about 65% in 2019. However, obviously we haven't seen the effect of coronavirus on these graphs yet. So they're the trends of home ownership in the US and the UK. Now let's have a look at the arguments for buying and also for not buying a house and whether it's right for you. Now, obviously, the first thing that you need to consider is your financial situation. Buying a house these days does mean that you need to pass certain barriers to entry, and these barriers to entry include, do you have enough for a deposit? A deposit is usually around 20% of the property value. Number two, do you have a good enough credit score to get a mortgage? Anything over 700 is considered good. However, this is going to vary from lender to lender. And the third big thing that you need to consider with regards to your finances is whether you have proof of a steady income over a number of years to be able to get that mortgage. Now, if you tick all these boxes, amazing. It's very likely that you're going to be able to buy a house, but that doesn't mean that buying a house is the right thing to do. Let's say that you are able to buy a house though, and you decide that you want to go ahead and do that. There are then two ways to consider how much house you can actually afford. One common rule that people use to determine this is the 28-36 rule. And what this rule is saying is that you should spend no more than 28% of your gross income on your mortgage. And this includes all other fees and insurances that come along with it as well. The second half of the rule then, the 36, is the cost of your mortgage and any other debt that you might already have, like a student loan or car repayment. Just to clarify here, we're talking about 28 and 36% of your monthly income. So how much you should proportion to your house every month. Now this rule does proportion a significant amount of your monthly income towards your house, which means that you're going to have to sacrifice on other investments and your savings as well. Which is why you might want to consider the second rule or the second method, which is the Dave Ramsey's 25% method. This rule basically proportions that you should only spend 25% of your take-home pay towards all housing costs. Now, I know the difference between the first rule that we looked at and the second method, 25% is not that much, right? But the difference there, if you didn't catch it, was that the first rule was 28% of your gross income, and the second rule, or the second method, was 25% of your take-home monthly income. Remember, monthly income. Okay, so following on from that then, and if you still want to buy a house, the next thing that you need to consider is actually getting a mortgage. Getting a mortgage now is one of the main benefits of buying a house in 2020 and probably through to 2021, because if you look at the mortgage rates, the interest rates on the mortgages, you're currently looking at being able to get around a 2.9% interest rate on a 30-year fixed term mortgage, whereas if you were to go back a couple of years, you'd have been looking at around 4% for the same deal. Now, before jumping the gun and taking out a massive mortgage, consider that this is a massive financial commitment, and you're going to want to consider the stability of your future finances. Things to consider are, have you got an emergency fund? An emergency fund is around 2 to preferably 6 months of living expenses. And so that should the worst happen, you've got 2 to 6 months of savings to cover yourself to live and to survive and pay your mortgage for up to 6 months, ideally anyway. And another thing to consider is income protection insurance. For example, my wife is an ophthalmology doctor in training, and as part of her job, she has to operate on people's eyes. And if she lost the ability to do that, if she had an accident which meant that her fingers or her hands didn't work properly, income protection would cover her salary up until the policy that we took out, at least up until the age that she is 60. I know at least in the UK, this isn't something that a lot of people consider, but income protection is a really, really, really important, I believe anyway, insurance to consider, especially if you're getting a mortgage. Okay, other fees to consider then are, number one, solicitors' fees. These are usually going to be between £1,000 and £2,000. For example, I recently bought a house and I paid £1,300 for my solicitor's fees. And again then, stamp duty. Stamp duty is a huge cost that you need to consider when buying a house. At least in the UK, I'm not 100% sure on the equivalent in the US, but in the UK you pay stamp duty tax when buying a house. Stamp duty tax is calculated as a percentage of the purchase price of whatever property you're buying. So say you're buying a property for 750 grand, the tax bracket on that is going to be 5%. And stamp duty is something that you always pay when you purchase a property. When you sell it, you have other fees, which we'll talk about in a minute, but stamp duty is paid when you buy a property. And you're never able to reclaim it. It's tax that goes to the government as part of the transaction and it's money lost. However, In the UK at least, the government has recently implemented a stamp duty holiday. This is something that has come about due to coronavirus and to help the housing market. However, what it does mean is that for anyone buying a residential property, be it your first home or if you're moving up or down the ladder, you're going to be exempt from having to pay stamp duty up until a value, which is currently £500,000, so £500,000. So if we take my house as an example again then, my house cost £250,000, which is well within the bracket, the £500,000 bracket. So I didn't have to pay any stamp duty on my purchase, which is one of the main reasons why I thought it was such a good deal and why I wanted to go ahead with the purchase when I did. In my situation and in normal times, if there was no stamp duty holiday, I would have had to have paid £7,500 stamp duty on the purchase. So that's a huge saving right off the bat. Thanks, Rishi. Okay, so we've looked at some pretty good reasons to buying a house, right? But it's not quite that simple. So let's take a look at some of the opportunity costs, the other places or the other things that you could be doing with that money, and sort of weigh them up against each other to see whether buying a house is the right thing for you in 2020 or 2021. Realize that when you buy a house, your money is going to be tied up and it's going to be extremely illiquid. If you want to get access to that money, you're going to have to sell the house, and you have to go through the whole process of appointing an estate agent to list a property, getting a solicitor to actually do the transaction, paying taxes again, capital gains in most cases. So your money is not going to be readily available if you need it. So that's the first thing to consider, and that's the first opportunity cost in this case. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that especially in current times in 2020, and I'm assuming in 2021 it's going to be the same, there is so much volatility in the stock market. There is so many opportunities to make money in the stock market. Now, one example would be to take your 20% deposit and put it into an index fund, something like the S&P 500, for example. Obviously, don't put it all into the S&P 500, but the S&P 500 is such a good option that I can't not mention it. Now, this might be a good opportunity if you're younger and you're able to take more risks because you don't have any dependents, you have less responsibilities, and you're nowhere near retiring. Whereas if you're in a position where you have more responsibilities, maybe a large family, then you may want to consider buying the house instead of that riskier investment of putting your money into the stock market. Now, just to summarize the differences on expected returns on your investment then, for your housing, you'd be expected to return around 3% a year, whereas on the stock market, you'd be expected to get around 8 to 10%. So obviously riskier, but potentially higher returns. And obviously, if you take into account inflation, you'd then be looking around 2% for housing, probably, and 6 to 8% for any investments. Okay, now how settled you are geographically is the next thing to consider. This is one of the main regrets that people have when buying a house, is buying a house in the wrong area or the wrong part of the country. And this is a serious consideration, because buying a house and selling it within 1 or 2 years is probably going to end up costing you money, not actually saving or making you anything. It's probably going to cost you more than even renting a property would. And the reason for this is that, at least in the UK, housing prices are currently at a 4-year high. And when you go on to sell, you've also got all the associated costs that you've got to think about again as well, which are the estate agent's fees, which is usually around 2 to 3%, depending on what part of the country you live in. Solicitors' fees, again, which we mentioned, are around £1,000 to £2,000. You've also got then your stamp duty on your next property that you buy. And because this time you're selling, you've also got capital gains. Even if the house price does increase between buying and selling, it's unlikely that it's going to increase enough to cover all of those costs. For example, my wife and I seriously considered how long we think we're going to live in the property that we recently purchased, and we believe that we're going to be there for around at least 7 years. Therefore, and even if we were just buying this house to live in and not do anything with, I would expect that the appreciation of the house over 7 years would cover all the costs when I come to sell it and move into a new one, plus there'd be a pot of profit left as well. Now, and if you are still considering buying a house, think about the difference between a new build and an existing home. New build properties have some great perks. These include being able to customize it before you move in some cases, and being able to move into a brand new house. Hopefully not having to worry about any structural, plumbing or electrical issues that come with existing houses. At least you would hope. However, a lot of home builders don't have a brilliant name when it comes to building quality homes. And I know quite a few people who have bought and rented new build houses or new build flats, and they've had serious trouble getting any issues resolved within the warranty period or getting any snags sorted out. Having said that, house builders obviously are held to very strict regulations, to building regulations, but I would take it one step further to say that it's not unheard of for things to be missed. When you're building in such bulk, you're building so many houses, and most of the time to an almost impossible program. So there are your arguments for and against buying a new home. And existing homes, they also have amazing perks. One of which is to be able to develop that property into something more you, or to be able to develop it to increase its value. Period charm is also something that people love when buying existing homes, and you can potentially get a better deal because instead of dealing with a corporation or a house builder, you're actually negotiating always directly, or at least through the estate agents, with another individual. And that individual might be more or less motivated to sell, meaning that you can potentially get a really good deal. Now, the main downsides to buying an existing house are sort of going to counter a lot of the perks anyway. One being that it may require work, it may require a lot of work. Therefore, you might not be able to straight away move into the house, or you may have to live on a building site for a period of time. Also, that house could be suffering from structural issues, so make sure that if you are thinking about buying an existing house, that you get a surveyor to properly check the property before you exchange contracts. Again though, anything flagged in a structural survey could actually be a good thing because it's a potential negotiation for you to further negotiate when that comes back. Now, if you do decide to buy, and whether you decide to buy new build or existing is going to depend on you. It's going to depend on your situation, what sort of help you have to be able to develop the property. If you don't have any help or experience in property developing or construction, it'd probably be a safer bet to go for the new build. Whereas if you've got experience in house building or construction, buying an existing house which requires work could be a much better investment than just buying a normal house. All right then, now the last thing to consider, and I've actually found out through research in this video that buying a house that's either too big or too small is actually one of the #1 regrets that people have when buying a house. So I guess don't stretch your budget too far, but also don't skimp out too much because you'll regret that as well. Also, take any parental or older generation advice with a pinch of salt. The reason for this is that your parents might encourage you to get the biggest, most expensive house that you can because they think you're going to get a bigger return on your investment. A lot of our parents grew up in basically a different world to us, a world where property prices increased so much that it even makes sometimes the stock market look like peanuts. Obviously, that's not the case everywhere, but the example that I'm thinking about currently is here in Singapore where I am now. My wife is Singaporean, so obviously her mother was giving advice to us, and here in Singapore, the housing market over the last 20 or 30 years was just phenomenal. So yeah, take this with a pinch of salt because things aren't what they used to be, but you should still get as much advice from as many people as you can and think about the current market that you're buying in now, and more importantly, the future market, the market that you're going to be selling in the future. Also consider repair and maintenance costs. Repair and maintenance costs are estimated to be around 4% of your house value per year. And obviously then it goes without saying that if you're stretching your budget to get the biggest house that you can, you're going to actually potentially be crippled by the repair and the maintenance costs of that house year on year in the future. All right then guys, so it's basically a toss-up between what for most people will be the majority of their money, the majority of their savings, and whether they want to put that into a property or more risky investments like the stock market. If you do decide to buy, remember the rules and the methods that we looked at earlier in this video, and if you don't, be sure to put that money into an investment elsewhere. Never keep your money saved in a shitty little savings account where it's going to be earning next to zero interest. That's the worst thing that you can do. All right then guys, I really hope that you enjoyed the video. I really enjoyed making this one, and if you're not already, please subscribe, hit the like button, and I'll see you next week.